Hi, I'm Jennifer Bassett from Thriving Grade 5. In this video, we are going to talk about how to teach the Declaration of Independence the fun way. I've been teaching upper elementary social studies for a long time now, and the Declaration of Independence is really important for our students to understand. It has a lot of large words and difficult concepts, but when you break down the Declaration of Independence into small pieces, our students can understand it very well. So why do we teach the Declaration? Well, this is one of our very important founding documents. The Second Continental Congress approved and signed the Declaration only after they had attempted reconciliation with England. Once they realized that reconciliation was not going to happen, they wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence. When I say wrote the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson was the main writer, but there were several men who were involved in the editing and wording process. So this declaration had to be precise because this was the justification to the world as to why the colonies had the right to leave England and break ties with the mother country. There are several sections of the Declaration of Independence. With my fifth graders, I talk about the preamble and grievances. Those are the main parts that will help them understand the road to revolution and into the battles and the events of the American Revolution. The preamble needs to be broken into small pieces for your students. The preamble explains why the Declaration was written. It's the most recognizable part of the Declaration. Don't ever just give the whole preamble to your students at one time and say, here you go, let's talk about this preamble. You've got to break it into small parts. We use our interactive notebooks for this. This is just an example of a chart that my students and I made in our interactive notebooks. The title at the top, Preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We talked about how a preamble is just the beginning part. You'll also find a preamble to the Constitution, which they'll learn about later when we get into new government. Declaration, they know that a declarative sentence is a sentence that makes a statement. So a declaration is just a statement of independence. This was a document in which the colonies stated, we are no longer going to be part of England. We are declaring our independence. On the left, these are the original words of the preamble, and then on the right, we translated these into our modern words. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, I guarantee my fifth graders, when they come in, have never heard the term self-evident. So we talk about how self-evident means making clear. So that phrase means we believe these true things to be clear or obvious, that all men are created equal. That's something, that term, all men are created equal, we'll get into that one in just a minute or two. Endowed by their creator. They probably have never heard the word endowed. So endowed by their creator just means they are given by God. Religious aspects were a big part of the 18th century. So you will run into pieces in original documents that talk about God. And if you don't make a big deal about that to students, it's usually completely fine. They just need to understand that there was a big religious influence in the 18th century. That's why these religious undertones will show up sometimes in original documents. Certain unalienable rights. Students have probably never heard the word unalienable. So we can break it up into parts, unalienable or able. And we talk about how that means that there are certain rights that cannot be taken away from us. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That phrase shows up in popular culture quite a bit. So students have usually heard that phrase before. So it means that these rights that are unalienable, that were given to us by God, that cannot be taken away, are life, liberty or freedom, and the pursuit of happiness, or the ability to do what makes you happy. Let's talk about all men are created equal. Unfortunately, in our modern time, this phrase has a different meaning to us. To us today, we think everyone, men, women, everyone is created equally. But in the 18th century, that phrase did not include women. It did not include indentured servants or enslaved individuals or even Native Americans. There was a disconnect between what the founding fathers meant by this phrase and what we think of it, what we think today. If you've set up a culture of respect and openness and honesty in your classroom, your students can have a great discussion about how in the 18th century, to them, all men meant free white men who owned property. Today, it means everybody, and that's how it should be. But of course, the 18th century was much different. They had much different mindsets and beliefs in the 18th century. So if you've set up that culture of respect, then you can have a discussion about what the founding fathers meant and what this phrase means today. Just be careful, because it is a very difficult topic when you get into talking about enslavement. Okay, let's talk about grievances. We all know that 5th graders have lots of grievances or complaints. She took my pencil without asking. He wrote something on my book. Lots of complaints back and forth. The majority of the Declaration of Independence listed grievances that the colonies had against England and King George III. Grievances are complaints. We've all the way through talking about the road to revolution, the events that led to the revolution, we've talked about grievances or complaints that the colonists had. So I make the word grievances an everyday word. If a student comes to me to complain about something, I ask them, what is your grievance? If they are having a little tiff with a classmate, I'll say, okay, what is the grievance that you have against John? Making that an everyday word helps students to internalize the meaning of grievances, and they start to think about how the colonies had a huge number of grievances against King George III. For my 5th graders, we don't talk about all of the grievances, and that's because there are some really complicated ones. So we talk about the grievances that they will recognize from the road to revolution. For example, in the Declaration, one grievance is quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. That's the Quartering Act. So they've heard about the Quartering Act. They understand what that meant. So we talk about how that was listed in the Declaration of Independence. And then later, when we get into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, that becomes the 3rd Amendment. So it's really cool to make those connections between the Road to Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and then the Bill of Rights. I love making those connections. Imposing taxes on us without our consent. Well, we know that taxation without representation was a huge issue in colonial America that helped lead to the Revolution. He kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Boston was seen as the troublemaking central city in colonial America, so the British Army had a large number of troops stationed in Boston to try to keep that city under control. So that was a big grievance that colonists had. He's made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. Can you imagine if judges were being paid and employed by King George III? Do you think they're going to rule fairly? Probably not. They're always going to be thinking, what would King George like for me to say or rule? Because he's paying their salaries. He's letting them have their job. So that would definitely be a big grievance because judges are not being fair. There is an amazing music video by Sumo Publishing. If you just type in Too Late to Apologize on YouTube, you will find this video. It's a music video that shows several of the founding fathers and their struggle to decide that, you know, we're not going to reconcile with England. This is King George III. They make him look really gross and yucky because when this music video portrays, that's how the colonists viewed King George III. So we watched the video all the way through, and then we watched the video again, but I stopped to discuss each person and some of the imagery in the music video. Like, for example, Thomas Jefferson, he's the main writer of the Declaration. Benjamin Franklin is in there. He's helping to edit and precisely word the Declaration. Sam Adams is in there with his beer mug. He was part of a brewery, so that's how we know it's Sam Adams, because he has his beer mug. So if you taught fifth graders, you know that fifth graders love drama. After we talk about the parts of the Declaration, I start the next class with a breakup letter. So what I do is I write out the breakup letter and I crumple it up and I find it on the floor. I'm going to show you the text of the breakup letter in just a second. So what I do is I find this letter and I say, I am so upset. You guys keep writing letters. I'm just going to start reading these letters out loud to the class. And maybe some peer shame will help you to remember to stop writing letters during class. So once I read this letter, I have an epiphany and I say, oh my goodness, this letter reminds me of the Declaration of Independence. These things here are grievances. These are complaints that the letter writer has against this other person. I'm breaking up with you because you're mean. I don't like how you let your friends use my locker without asking me first. Quartering act. I hate how you act like I can only share things with you. That one reminds me of the Tea Act and how the colonies were only supposed to buy tea from the East India Company. So I don't usually tell the students that I wrote the letter. I let them stew on it for, honestly, it lasts for days. They're all trying to figure out who wrote this letter. but their attention is so focused on me, and when I'm talking about this letter, it makes such a great review of the Declaration of Independence. And honestly, you could hear a pin drop when we do this breakup letter. So students need to understand that writing and signing the Declaration was a serious, somber event. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence did not just wake up one day and say, woohoo, we get to sign the Declaration. They were risking everything. They were risking their lives, their families, all of their property. This document was treason. And if the revolution was lost, these men would be hunted down and they would be executed. So this wasn't an easy thing to do. Signing the Declaration was a huge risk. I'm sure we all know of John Hancock's signature. He wanted to sign his name so big that King George could read it without his glasses. And, just looking at the size of his signature, I think he achieved that. Benjamin Franklin, you can always count on him for something witty. He said, "We must indeed all hang together," meaning all of the colonies must stick together, "or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." So if we don't stick together on this issue or with this document, we are all going to hang by our necks separately. This beautiful plaque talks about how the signers of the Declaration were risking everything. 9 signers died of wounds that they sustained during the Revolution. 5 of them were captured, put in prison. Their wives and children were killed or put in jail or mistreated or left with nothing. 12 signers' houses were burned, and 17 lost everything they owned. And what's incredible about this is that not a single one of the signers defected or turned themselves over to England or turned their back on the Declaration of Independence. They all stayed committed. That's incredible. One last thing, my students love to get on Google Earth. So if you let them get on Google Earth and type in Independence Hall, they can see where it is situated within Philadelphia, and it gives them a little information over here. If you switch to Street View, you can stand in front of Independence Hall virtually, of course, and it's like you're standing there looking up at Independence Hall. It's very, very interesting for students. If you Google Independence Hall virtual field trip, there are a few different organizations that have some virtual field trips where you can look inside Independence Hall. If you can't go there, like my students, we're in Oklahoma, we can't go to Independence Hall, but the next best thing is Google Earth and a virtual field trip. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I would love for you to send comments or questions. I will put my email address and my website in the comments or under the video. Thanks for watching.